I'd like to thank Noom for sponsoring this video. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about blast beats, a topic very near and dear to my heart, because back when I was first getting into metal and hardcore back in the day, I was obsessed with blast beats. And for anybody who's not familiar, basically a blast beat is when a drummer plays really, really fast like this. And back then, they were pretty rare, but I was always hunting for them like legendary Pokemon or something, because there's just something about the intensity and aggression of blast beats. It's like the musical equivalent of like just taking a huge hit of like pure crack, and you just like blast off, no pun intended. But these days, it is very different. Now they're everywhere. They're anything but rare. And so the question is, how did we get here? How did they become so popular? How have they changed over time? And are they still as intense as they used to be, or have they gotten watered down? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, I wanted to mention I'm streaming on Twitch twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's a link to that in the description of this video. But first, I want to thank Noom for sponsoring this video. And if you want to lead a healthier life, then Noom is for you. Every day with Noom, you'll get a new lesson that helps create long-term results through habit and behavior change, not restrictive dieting. For example, one of the lessons is break the behavior chain, which helps you break out of unhealthy patterns of behavior using well-known principles of psychology. But that is just one part of Noom. I've always been pretty good about diet and exercise, but these days I am busier than ever, and I really like their selection of recipes because I can never really think of what to cook, so it's great to just be able to scroll through a list and pick something. You can also use Noom to track your food and exercise, which I highly suggest doing. They also have really exceptional support staffed by real people who are trained in psychology, fitness, and nutrition. So if you want to live a healthier life, then click the link below or go to noom.com/punkrock to take your free Noom evaluation. It's quick, easy, and will help you create your own custom plan. So check it out and enjoy. So according to Wikipedia, the very first blast beat was played by the legendary jazz drummer Tony Williams. Now, personally, I don't really think that that is a true blast beat in the way that we think of it now. To me, that's just like part of a fill or a drum solo that kind of sounds like a blast beat, but that's really not what it is. The first proper blast beat that I have been able to find, at least, is actually by the Beastie Boys from their 1981 song Riot Fight. And the key thing to understand here about this era is that blast beats were really like a punk and hardcore thing, not really a metal thing. It was more like just a natural extension of punk bands trying to play louder, faster music that was even more obnoxious than the Sex Pistols or Black Flag. And there were a lot of bands doing this stuff back in the early to mid 80s, doing the quote-unquote fastcore thing. For example, DRI, Septic Death, Siege, Deep Wound, Larm. But one really pivotal band that gets overlooked a lot is NYC Mayhem, a hardcore band from New York, as you might guess from the name, with members who would go on to be in bands like Sick of It All and Biohazard. And I point to them because even though they really were just kind of like a local band that was only around for a couple years, their 1985 demo was really influential and had an outsized impact. This demo made its way around the world via the tape trading scene of the 80s, and it's credited by bands like Brutal Truth, Carcass, Napalm Death, and Repulsion as the thing that inspired them to play blast beats. If you listen to the song Milk by SOD, you can really especially hear the influence on that band, which in turn is one of the bands that popularized blast beats for a larger audience. And I'm not saying that like that particular demo was the genesis of blast beats or anything like that, but if you look at the list of bands that they directly influenced, I do think it was pretty important. The other band to mention here, maybe more than anybody else, is DRI. One of the very first bands to make just speed the emphasis of the band, and a band that unfortunately you don't really hear their name brought up these days as much as it should be, because they were extremely important in many more ways that I'll talk about in another video some other time. Which brings me to the second wave of blast beats from roughly 1987 to 1995 or so. And this era, at least from my point of view, was really defined by Earache Records. This was the beginning of grindcore as a genre, and the point where blast beats became more of like a metal thing than a punk thing. And at least to me, the most important band here is Napalm Death, who were really synonymous with grindcore as a genre and with blast beats in particular after the release of their first album Scum in 1987. And listening to this stuff now, it may not sound like it, but this was just absolutely insane, ridiculously extreme, brutal stuff back then that just really completely changed the game for extreme music and like almost just music in general. They really just kind of broke the mold. Like what they were doing was just so shockingly different that they even got on UK TV back then for their infamous 4-second song, You Suffer.
So let's lighten the mood here, a little madness on the BBC. Was that it?
And I personally was obsessed with this album. Like, I just couldn't believe that there was music that existed that was this fast and aggressive. And I looked at the back and I saw that it was put out by a label called Earache Records with a cool, brutal logo, which led me to picking up a compilation called Grind Crusher, which was like the holy grail of blast beats back then. It had just a who's who of hardcore / grindcore bands like Heresy, Sore Throat, and Unseen Terror, as well as the genre that at the time was new, exciting, and very scary, known as death metal, with bands like Bolt Thrower, Nocturnus, Carcass, and most importantly, Morbid Angel and Terrorizer, both of which featured Pete Sandoval on drums, who I would consider as the man that really perfected the blast beat as we know it. As Dino from Fear Factory said on Twitter when I asked about it, the 1989 album by Terrorizer called World Downfall wasn't the first blast beat by any means, but it was probably the first time that anybody played them that clean and tight with more like quote-unquote metal production as opposed to like raw punk production. And along with his playing on the first Morbid Angel album, made a whole generation of metal bands start blasting. And this is really when blast beats started to evolve from just playing as fast as you fucking can in an almost like arrhythmic sense to being something more refined, and even different styles of blast beats started to get developed. For example, the Cannibal Corpse style of bomb blast, where the kick drum hits twice for every snare hit. There's also the black metal style of blasting that's almost like the old school Napalm Death kind of grindcore blast, but instead of this sporadic stop and go thing, it's just this relentless non-stop assault of blasting. Or my personal favorite, the quote-unquote hammer blast as pioneered by Suffocation, where the kick, snare, and cymbal all hit at the same time. Shout out to Mike Smith for creating this, easily one of my favorite metal drummers of all time. As well as all the power violence bands like Spaz, No Comment, Capitalist Casualties, Crossed Out, that were really sort of picking up where Napalm Death and Infest and so forth left off. And before I go on, I just want to quickly pause and say that I'm not presenting this video as like the single authoritative comprehensive history of blast beats. This is just my own personal point of view as somebody who was very into fast music at the time and watched blast beats evolve, but it is only that. It's just my perspective, which by definition is incomplete. For example, there's probably a lot of stuff about black metal that I'm not really doing justice here. So check the comments. I'm sure lots of other people will bring all that stuff up that I didn't. But moving on, although blast beats had gotten more common as recently as the mid-90s, it was actually kind of rare to find a drummer who could play blast beats. They were certainly out there, but they were not by any means common. Which brings us to the third wave of blast beats from roughly 1996 to 2005. And I personally think of this as the golden age of blast beats. First of all, because this is when people got really good at blast beats. They became a lot more widely used. Drummers started to play them in a much more musical way than just, hey, wow, listen how fast this is. But before metal production had gotten to the point where drums were just edited and sample replaced to death, to the point where just all the life had been stripped out of them, a point which I will talk about in more detail in a little bit. And I can't possibly list every drummer or band here, but I'll mention a few that were a big deal for me personally. First of all, Cryptopsy, who had been around for a while, but I didn't hear them until I think like 96 or 97, because it was actually really hard to find their music back then. And if you haven't checked out their early stuff, you really should. Flo Mornier's drumming on this stuff is absolutely beautiful. And in particular, his blasts, which I think it was kind of like the perfection of that Napalm Death style grind blast. Another really huge one for me was Trading Pieces by Deeds of Flesh in 1996, which took that suffocation kind of sound to a whole other level of brutality and precision, especially the drumming, which at least in my circles just absolutely blew everybody away. It was so crazy and hyperactive, but at the same time so clean and precise. The blasts just sounded so effortless. Still love this album. Another mind-blowing one for me was the first Origin album from 1999, which I'm pretty sure is the first example of a gravity blast in death metal. Certainly the first time I had heard one anyway, which if you're not familiar is basically a one-handed roll using the rim of the snare as a fulcrum. This was popularized in jazz by a guy named Johnny Rabb.
The idea is to stay parallel to the rim or whatever surface you're hitting and drop the elbow down to where they hit in unison. Head and rim, down, head and rim, up. So head and rim, down, head and rim, up.
But this was the first time I'd heard it in metal, and I was just so confused. I was like, wait, he's playing 30-second notes on the snare, but I can also hear the hi-hat going. Like, how is this possible? He doesn't have enough arms for that. And to this day, the drumming on this album was some of the most intricate, just strange, cool death metal drumming I've ever heard. It's very like odd and disjointed, but very musical at the same time. Definitely check it out if you haven't. And also the first Decrepit Birth album from 2003, featuring Tim Young on drums, which I consider to be the birth of the really modern style of technical death metal. I remember hearing this album for the first time, and it was just like a shot of adrenaline like directly in my neck. The whole album was so over the top, and really like the bedrock of all of that was his drumming, which was just so clean and so relentlessly fast. Another high watermark for death metal in general, in particular death metal drumming, is Nile, who had been around for a while. But when they got George Kollias on drums in the mid-2000s, it was just like an instant, massive level up for them. Out of everybody in this era of metal drumming, he might be the ultimate, just most ridiculous in terms of pure speed, blasting in ways that 20 years earlier, nobody would have thought was even humanly possible. This guy is ridiculous. Although without a doubt, the most significant moment, if we're talking about the overall evolution of blast beats, was not from the death metal scene, it was from the nu metal scene when Slipknot put out their album Iowa in 2001, which essentially opens with a blast beat in the first actual real song on the album. Blast beats may have been relatively old news to the small number of people who are into underground death metal, black metal, power violence, grind, stuff like that. But to everyone else, they were totally unknown. Even people who are into relatively mainstream metal like Metallica or Korn. So I think the impact of Slipknot and Joey Jordison in particular in popularizing blast beats really can't be overstated. Which brings us to the modern era of blast beats from roughly 2006 to now. And the defining thing to me about this era is that blast beats are no longer this like secret hidden knowledge known only to the initiates of the inner circle. Thanks to Slipknot and the internet, now everybody knows about blast beats and they've become way more widespread. The rise of the deathcore scene in the mid to late 2000s is when this became really apparent to me. This is when Job for a Cowboy, Suicide Silence, Despised Icon, and all those other bands came out who clearly had nothing to do with the death metal scene. You could tell that they were really more along the lines of like suburban hardcore or Warped Tour kind of kids, and yet their music was full of blast beats, probably because they grew up on Slipknot. I saw all that kind of unfolding and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Brutal death metal has officially finally trickled down down to the Hot Topic kids. And whether you like deathcore or not, I personally thought it was pretty cool. Obviously, a lot of the metal people didn't. But either way, that stuff was very popular with a whole generation of kids who would have otherwise never fucked with any kind of like brutal death metal or grind or anything like that. So it did a lot to further popularize blast beats. And because of the internet and social media that were really kind of coming into their prime, now anybody was able to share technique in a way that wasn't really possible to do before, because you had to invest in filming and distributing like a professionally recorded drumming DVD, which obviously not that many people can do. And this created a whole new generation of drummers who built their following online. For example, Marco Petrozelli, aka Lord Marco, who first kind of broke onto the scene playing in Brain Drill, who kind of popped off on MySpace. And then he eventually leveraged that into drumming for The Faceless, 6 Feet Under, and tons more bands. Like, go look up his resume. It's ridiculous. And it all started on MySpace. And all this global experimentation and online networking also moved the technique forward, with people breaking blast beats down into even more of these like nuanced variations, like the stop and go blast or the inverse skank beat. And so over the course of 20 years or so, it finally happened. The blast beat had gone from essentially just punk drummers flailing as fast as they possibly could to now being a legitimate part of drumming technique. With that being said, I do kind of wonder if something has kind of gotten lost along the way. There's a part of me that almost feels like blast beats aren't even heavy or aggressive anymore. Now, to be fair, that could be because I've been listening to them for 30 years and maybe I'm just numb to them at this point. But I also think a lot of that has to do with the style of a lot of modern metal production, where everything is so edited and sample replaced that, at least to me, it kind of kills that human feel that is what gives a blast beat all that aggression and energy. Like, listen to old Cryptopsy from the 90s, and you can hear Flo just straining to play that fast. Like, if you listen, he's hitting the snare way less hard towards the end of this blast part. And yes, that is technically imperfect, but I would say that's exactly why it's so intense, because you can feel him straining, as opposed to the newer style of production where they would quote unquote fix those imperfections, but at least to me, strip out all the feeling and make it just so sterile and inhuman that it just kind of doesn't make me feel anything to listen to it. Or maybe I am just old and out of touch, who knows? But either way, I'm sure that as much as blast beats have evolved since the 80s, the next generation will keep evolving the blast beat from here and take it to places that even now nobody could have ever thought was possible, and I'm here for it. Alright my friends, that does it for this video. Check me out on Twitch if you want to join the fun of my live streams. Also, as always, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every podcast a week early. I also do Q&As, I do giveaways sometimes, and there's a way to have me review your music or artwork. You just need to join at the $10 and up level. Every month I do a call for submissions. Just drop your music in the comments of that post. I will review it on Twitch, posted on Patreon for everyone to see, and that's it. So if that sounds cool to you, check it out at the link in the description of this video. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.